Hi, Rachel. How are
Hey
you?
Anne, how are you doing? I'm good.
Great. Good. Good. You're saying it's hot where you are. It's cold where I am.
It's just the greenhouse effect of my windows.
Yeah. So we're here to talk about how you prepare clients for interviews.
Yeah.
And
So,
you had a lot to say on this topic.
oh
Um,
yeah,
we'll try to keep it short just to make sure that people get the salient points, but then maybe go into a few details. The first
sure.
one's about context, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'll go through the five things that I think are important and then I'll go into context. But I think, the first thing is context. Are you looking for a transition or are you just looking for a job? We'll talk about this in a second. The second point is strategy. What are your goals and what are the trade-offs you're willing to make? The third one is going to be what are your stories or insecurities? Who are you? What are you proud of? What are you insecure about? Then, tactically, what do you need to prepare? And then finally, mocks and debriefs, which are probably a lot of the meat and potatoes. But, if I start with context, even though, especially in the past year, 18 months, there's a lot of layoffs and some people are just looking for a job, transitions are probably more of what I work with, and transitions are a lot harder to get to. And when you're making a transition, sometimes you need to sacrifice, your title. Sometimes you need to learn a new context. Sometimes you need to make some sort of a payment adjust, like a payroll adaptation. So, the context is really important to understand what you're looking for.
I
And
don't want to
based on that,
interrupt you, but let's just make sure we define this. What is a transition?
for me, a transition can be probably one or two or three things. The first
Mhm.
thing is you are doing job X and you want to do job Y. So that could mean, oh, right now you're a software engineer and you want to transition into a product manager. It's like
Mhm.
one example. And that actually is a process that can take a few years. It's not going to happen overnight, especially not in this economy. Another example can be, you want to get a promotion, and you're trying to package up your impact and map out the stakeholders and what you need to drive in order to get that promotion. Um, and the third thing could be maybe you want to keep the same role, but maybe switch the context of the industry that you're working in. So maybe, I don't know, you're a product manager in B2C, you want to transition to B2B or something like that.
Right. Well, speaking of industry, we were talking earlier offline about the tech industry, and you mentioned something interesting about Google, for
Oh,
example,
yeah.
trying to transition.
Yeah, I was talking to an engineer at Google a few weeks ago, and this isn't the first conversation I've had with people at Google, but they are saying, I want to switch into product management. And it's actually interesting because the joke is at Google that if you want to transition into a product manager, you might as well quit your job and reapply because the internal transfer process is so complicated, especially now when with all the layoffs and headcounts being closed. But and then, for that person who's an engineer at Google, it's not going to be necessarily a straight shot. You're probably going to switch to a startup as a product manager in an entry level position, which means slashing your pay,
Right.
because, at a place like Google, you earn very much and your equity is liquid. So you might be moving to a less flashy company, less of a logo company to get the title and get the initial experience before you can rebuild yourself again, right? So that's an example of a context and also the strategy, right? It's if it's really
Right.
hard to transfer internally. In smaller companies, maybe transfers are a bit easier and you can identify problems that you can solve. And then, you do the role and then you make the case for the official transition. So it really depends on the context as well.
Mhm. Yeah, so you
Um,
mentioned strategy. Let's talk about strategy.
Yeah. So I think when you're thinking about strategy, the way I see it, I think there are like four things we need to do: a bit of diagnostics and understanding. What are your goals? Where do you want to go? And when do you expect to get there?
Mm.
What are your gaps? So the second thing is, what are your gaps to meet those goals? What is the experience, the polish, or skills that you're maybe lacking on that you need to build on, or relationships that you need to build? what are trade-offs and how do you evaluate those trade-offs? So I spoke, for example, about that engineer example at Google, like, are you willing to take a pay cut? Are you willing to relocate? I think there's a saying that there's probably three things that you can take out of a job, right? Um, there's your title,
Mhm.
there's your compensation, there's your location, and then there's your interest. So four things. It's very
Mhm.
rare that you can get all four,
Mhm.
probably two, three if you're lucky. So what do you value most and what are you willing to, how do you think about these trade-offs, right? And then based on that, we can do a bit of an alignment of expectation and a bit of a roadmap plan of, okay, who do you need to get in touch with? Who do you need to know? What is the network that you need to have? What are the types of stories you need to develop? What are the kinds of things you need to work on to get this, whether you're actively interviewing or not? So that's on the strategy piece.
It sounds like you're calling it strategy, which I think is a great bucket. It sounds like within that bucket, there's the mindset piece, and then there's and then what do you do with that? Because a lot of times people psych themselves out of interviews because they don't actually want the role that they are interviewing
Hmm.
for, or they're worried that the gap is too big and they're not going to be, and then they don't self-manage their
Yeah,
own insecurities. So,
that's a really good point. And I think people that are interviewing for roles they don't necessarily want, I think that might be the case with layoffs. Um,
right.
you know, I saw that on myself like 6 or 7 years ago when a startup I worked for shut down and I had 2 months to find a job because I'm on an H-1B and I picked a great company, but it wasn't necessarily the best cultural fit for me.
Mhm.
And really, I love that company. It just, and so sometimes you need to psych yourself up and you need to set up the mindset because sometimes, you just need to get it.
Right.
I don't know if this answers your question, but I think it's a question of like for somebody going through a transformation, it's a bit easier to be picky and wait for the right opportunity and evaluate that opportunity more critically than somebody who, is looking for a job.
Right.
And that mindset is important. And it's actually funny because similar to dating, I
Hmm.
like the it seems to be that the people who aren't looking are the people who it seems to be that way that have it easier,
Right.
but I think it might be also an energy piece, right?
Hmm. Right.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned stories. I mentioned insecurities, and that's kind of your next
Yeah.
piece of this puzzle,
What are,
right?
yeah, I mentioned this as well. What are your stories and insecurities? So what's leading you to make this? What are some of the things? What is the spinach in your teeth that you're worried about?
Mm.
Um, and how do we flesh that out? And, if I'm very frank, I can see what my spinach in my teeth is that on the spectrum of switching things, I switch things. And, how do you tell your story? Or
Mhm.
if there is a resume gap, what do you do about a resume gap? Even though, it's 2023 and many people have resume gaps, in many cases, it's just an indication that you're fortunate to have a life outside of work and be able
Right.
to take time for yourself, reflect, build skills, or build stamina for the next phase of your career, right?
Right, but it's a
Um,
question of how you present it.
exactly,
Absolutely. Hmm.
exactly. And there's no silver bullet there. And, that's where I think I help my clients is figure things out together. And, you know, if this is the spinach in your teeth, then, let's acknowledge it and think about, let's address it head on and think about what is the story that you want to tell here and how do you want to present it
Right.
in a way
Right.
that
In your
reflects
in your
well.
metaphor, what are your teeth?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then, you need to do, you know, once you do that, then tactically we go into what you need to prepare. And I like thinking about it in terms of like, what is your pitch and what are your stories?
Mm.
When I talk about a pitch, I actually want to talk about the pitch because I think this is something, 90 seconds, make sure what are your skills and accomplishments should take about 30 seconds. Why you're talking, what's exciting to you about the position at hand, the
Mm.
next 30 seconds, and then the final 30 seconds can be a bit shorter. Why do you think, given your skills and accomplishments and the role at hand, that this is a good fit that helps you and the company reach mutual success.
Mhm.
So that's kind of like something I really like clients to think about. And, the second thing is stories and preparing stories around, success, failure, conflict resolution.
Right. Any of those things they could throw at you in the interview, those
Exactly.
curveball
And
questions. Mhm.
yeah. And once we get through that, then we do mocks and debriefs. And, in mock interviews, you play the role of the interviewer and, somebody will say, well, I can just do mocks, but mocks aren't enough because practice makes permanent, not perfect. The
Mhm.
debrief is where you actually identify what are your strengths and weaknesses and how do you overcome them and present them well.
Right. Right. That feedback is how you get out of the idea of a feedback loop, that you're constantly getting the same feedback, that now you're getting new information in.
Yep, exactly.
So, closing thoughts.
It's not easy, but it can be done. It's a journey. And
Yeah.
in many cases, especially with transition, it's not necessarily even about your next role. Sometimes it can be about the role after your next role.
Mhm. Right.
Um,
Where are you
Buckle
trying
up.
to get to?
Yeah,
Um,
seatbelts on.
yeah. Okay.
Emotional seatbelts on.
Hands and feet inside the boat, that whole
Yep,
thing.
yep,
But the larger strategy, I like that you said it's not just about your next role, because right, it's about what are you building over the
yeah.
long
And
term.
sometimes, it's funny
That's
because
hard to
sometimes I
see.
tell my clients, especially if somebody's been a lot at the place for a very long time, I tell them, if you've been at one place very long, maybe for your next role, it's okay to think about what makes you happy for the next year or two and not necessarily think about 5 years. God knows that for me, thinking about longer than a year or two is really hard, if I'm very honest. But, sometimes it's okay to say, you just need to think about this and then, from there, evaluate what you want to do next. Like, I don't think that it needs to be set in stone. And, people are very tied to like, where do you see yourself in 5 years? But honestly, in the world that we're living in today, in 20, you know, in December of 2019, did anyone think that 2020 would look the way it did or any
Right.
other year after that? So sometimes, but I like to think about that 5 years and North Star
Mhm.
of, I don't want to sound like, I don't want to sound goofy, but like a North Star of energy. What do you think over the next 5 years is going to give you energy and going to help you build the skills and background that you're interested in, curious about, or motivated to pursue for whatever reason?
Right,
There isn't
motivated
one
because the
way.
tech industry, among others, but we've talked about the tech industry a lot in other videos. It's so turbulent that you do need a North Star. You do need energy to get you going every day, even if things aren't always going well.
Oh, for sure. For
And at
sure.
your dream job, which, as you said, you can't have all of the different pieces that you're looking for necessarily in any job. Um,
And sometimes be careful what you wish for.
that's right. That's right. I feel like we can end just there because that sounds like such a bad premonition.
No, I'm just being funny.
But it does lead to the idea of interviewing back and looking for red flags and following your gut on
That's
things.
actually really true. You're interviewing the company or the team just as much as they're interviewing you. And that's something that's really important to remember. And it's easy to forget, especially when you're not looking for a transition, when you're just looking for a job. It's really easy to just get carried away and focused on getting the job. And then, that can lead into a bad fit and not a best outcome that takes a while to recover from. But I want to try and finish on a positive note, which is, there are probably you can't control a lot of things, but I think what you can probably control are your preparation, your confidence, and your energy. Those are probably the three things that you can try to control in this process and should help you set up for success.
And that's exactly what you can help people do. So
Yep.
that's a great place to close.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anne.
We'll talk again soon.